There are so many problems in this world, but to me, climate change stands out as the largest. It affects every person in every nation, yet it's getting worse and worse every day. It feels like we all hear the warnings, yet not everyone believes them. And even if everyone did, as an individual, I think we feel powerless. With no solutions in sight, the problem continues on. I've always been aware of climate change, but I didn't start getting scared until I saw an article by the New York Times. The article said, "A landmark report from the United Nations Scientific Panel on Climate Change paints a far more dire picture of the immediate consequences of climate change than previously thought, and says that avoiding the damage requires transforming the world economy at a speed and scale that has no documented historic precedent." The report, issued on Monday by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, a group of scientists convened by the United Nations to guide world leaders, describes a world of worsening food shortages and wildfires and a mass die-off of coral reefs as soon as 2040, a period well within the lifetime of much of the global population. This was much worse than I realized, so I decided to go find out for myself how climate change might transform not only our world, but our society. My quest for answers started with a presentation at SIU by Dr. Justin Schoaf, the chair of the geography department. I attended, I listened, and I took some notes, but the real takeaway I got from his presentation is that he said we should be thinking about climate change as something we should have acted on a long time ago. With that in mind, I decided to go to the geography department here at SIU, where I interviewed Dr. Justin Schoaf along with Dr. Trent Ford and Dr. Leslie Durham.
So the IPCC is sort of an arm of the UN, of the United Nations. And the reason that the IPCC came into being is because there was a recognized need for regular assessments of the science on climate change. So the idea was that we needed a body that could regularly review the science and make suggestions about sort of where we've been, where we're headed, what the implications are, how we can avoid the impacts of climate change and that sort of thing. So that was the idea. So the IPCC got into producing these regular assessment reports. So I want to say the first one was maybe in 1999, and then in 2013, 2014, they released the fifth assessment report. The IPCC sort of acts as an engine that kind of keeps the climate change science machine moving along, and in that sense, it's great. We have, lots of climate model output that's made available to anybody that wants it through this process. So it really is valuable for the scientific community. In addition to those comprehensive assessment reports, the IPCC also produces special reports. And the report that I talked about last week on 1.5 degrees C of warming is an example of one of those special reports.
Basically what it did is it gave us 12 years to say that, we, in 12 years, without any sort of, give or take, some uncertainty about that, without any sort of mitigation efforts, we are going to reach this 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, and beyond that, we really don't have a good idea of what's happening, but we know it's going to be bad. So the way to interpret and Justin may have talked about this too, but the way to interpret a lot of the report, especially those numbers, 2030, 1.5 degrees Celsius, is not as absolute thresholds that if we stay under those, we're good. That's not true at all. There was actually two really high impact papers that were published yesterday talking about documented impacts on hurricane rainfall rates in the US from climate change. And these aren't studies that are looking at future projections, as many climate change studies do. These are studies that have looked at historical data, so actual observations. So basically what they were saying is that we expect climate change to influence hurricanes, but we're seeing it now. It's not 2030, we're seeing this now. And so that's a good way to understand climate change, that climate change has happened already. We're seeing impacts now. It's just that if we need to mitigate those and reduce emissions so that we can keep ourselves under that 1.5 degree threshold. And giving that 2030 year is one way for the IPCC to tell people, like, look, this isn't in the far future. This is if you're a working person right now, this is before most of you will retire.
So everything that the IPCC puts out is really based on a review of existing science, a review of existing literature. And the goal then is to try to provide some sort of consensus information. Now, as you could imagine, if you put 20 or 30 academics in a room and try to get them to agree on language, it's not going to be easy to do. So you can imagine how painstaking it is to have all of these scientists together trying to come to an agreement about the specific language that should be used in these reports that are then widely picked up by the media, widely picked up by governments, et cetera. So it's really important to get it right. And because of that, I think the IPCC reports tend to be a little on the conservative side, if anything, in the sense that you can't really make an extreme statement if you're required to have a consensus.
It's really interesting because what I saw in the media was a sudden urgency because of that report. And I thought, yeah, of course. I mean, why are you so surprised? Why now the sudden urgency? We've been saying this for years. Sadly, that was my first thought. Like, why are people just now realizing it? I mean, I guess I was happy on the one hand because, oh, finally, the media is realizing the urgency. And always before it seemed like, oh, you have to think about your grandkids and, oh, your great-grandkids. No, it's right now. It's today. It's you and me now. I was, I guess, pleased that the media had, picked up on that, and yet sort of surprised that it took this long for people to realize that, yes, it is that urgent. It's right now. We have to take action now. This is not kick the can down the road and, oh, we'll deal with it in a few generations. This is not, oh, 2100 seems so far away. No, it's right now. It's occurring right now, and we need to take action right now.
This is a huge problem to overcome. These are sometimes referred to as wicked problems, right? These are problems that are extremely hard to solve because they require both maybe some economic pain, but they're also sort of ingrained in things like energy, national security, economic development, technology, energy, renewables versus non-renewables. There's all of these sort of underlying issues. What we have to overcome is formidable in order to make this happen. And the reason I think it's not feasible, I tend to be a little pessimistic as a person, but I think we've done so little so far to do anything about climate change. All the way from denying that it exists, denying that we're responsible for it, right? We're just kind of like slowly moving across this spectrum to where we finally maybe come to terms with the fact that we are indeed changing the climate. And until we recognize that there's a problem, we're not going to solve the problem. Until we all agree that there's a problem, we're not going to solve the problem. And we have to have people that are in decision-making roles that understand that this is an important problem that requires being solved. Even if we were in that situation, I still think we would have trouble getting to 1.5 degrees C because the kinds of societal transformations that are required. I mean, think about something like the average fuel economy of a vehicle. Go to the parking lot outside here and take a look at those vehicles, do an inventory, and tell me what the average fuel economy is. Well, in order to even have like one little slice of the pie to get us to 1.5 degrees C, all the vehicles in that parking lot need to be getting about triple the fuel economy that they're getting now. So how do we do that? How do we replace our entire fleet of vehicles? How do we replace our entire antiquated electricity production systems, right? And how do we do that in such a short time window that it's not too late? But nevertheless, I think that there's still, it's still worth trying to stabilize the climate at any possible target we can. It doesn't have to be 1.5 degrees C. If we can stabilize the climate at 3 degrees C, that's better than 5 degrees C, right? And so every increment that we warm will be associated with greater impacts.
I think environmental education is the most important first step. Right now, let's get everybody on board with this. Let's teach them the facts about climate change, not stick our head in the sand, not pretend pretend that we don't know. We know. Let's teach the basics to everyone. I think in our education system, unfortunately, we separate things, right? So we have biology, the hard sciences, physics and chemistry, and then we have history and social studies. And we don't put the two together, like environmental studies, we don't put those together very often. People and science, people and the environment, that's environmental studies, and we need to study that. But unfortunately, we don't have those set as standards in our education system. We have the hard science, we have the social studies, and we don't merge those. Once we get students thinking about their actions and how they, as a human, impact the environment, then we can think more broadly about environmental policies and all of those sorts of things that are so important. So I don't know if I have it here or not. I was going to, oh yeah. Interestingly, so we all know that it's important to teach about the environment and climate change in class. But there was this rather interesting, there is a movement, and I can send you the article if you want, but this is a book from the Heartland Institute, and it was sent to something like, I don't know, thousands and thousands of teachers, mostly elementary teachers. But in any case, they made this book, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. And they sent it to thousands and thousands of teachers. So they're trying to educate, so there's a DVD in there and all of this, and I happen to be on the list. And it's really tricky because on the front it says, as reported by the New York Times, ExxonMobil investigated for possible climate change lies by Attorney General. So it says New York Times, but then actually it has nothing to do with the New York Times. It is this, the Heartland Institute is a climate denying lobbying group, I guess. So, it's a climate denying organization that is funded by fossil fuel industry, and they talk about all the, problems with climate change and climate science and all of these things in here. So they're sending these out to teachers to try and encourage them to teach the denialist side of climate change. It's really disheartening. When I got this in the mail, I wanted to cry because I know the background. I know what the Heartland Institute is all about, but I just can't help but think that some busy high school teacher and they're, oh my gosh, trying to teach all these kids and, deal with all of the various activities going on at the high school, they might very well pick this up and, oh, cool, an alternative text. Let's think about some of this and the evidence of the lack of consensus on climate change. Wow, oh, interesting. Maybe I should present some of this in class. So we need to do a really good job of educating people about the truth that scientists think.
There's no real scientific debate at this point about whether the world is warming or whether humans are causing it. That's pretty much done. And if we hadn't had so much distraction, and I don't want to sugarcoat it either. I mean, the misinformation that's been spread about climate change is absolutely deliberate and aimed at patting the pockets of people that have interests in fossil fuels and other things, generally speaking, in a similar way that the big tobacco companies denied the effects of smoking and secondhand smoke for years until it finally came to be that they couldn't deny it anymore. And that's kind of the situation we're at with climate change too, is that as time goes on, the evidence gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It becomes harder to deny and harder to deny. And so we started out with, the world isn't warming. The temperature records aren't reliable. Well, now we have temperature records from satellites, from ocean buoys, from land-based stations, all kinds of sources, and they all say the same thing. So then it became, well, humans aren't responsible for it. Well, now we have much stronger attribution science, and we have the ability to say with a high level of certainty that humans are responsible for it as well. So then the argument becomes, well, do we really need to do anything about it? Is it worth the economic pain? What are the trade-offs? And that's an argument you can have, but you can't have that argument if you're saying that it's not warming or that we're not causing it. So do you see that we've delayed action for at least a decade, probably 2 decades, because of a deliberate misinformation campaign. When we think about sustainable development, we have to keep in mind that it also has an economic and a social lens, right? So if I think about something like Southern Illinois and how Southern Illinois makes their sort of energy transition, one of the real trade-offs we have here is that we have a strong tradition of coal production. And so if we close all the coal mines and then we move toward renewables, say we build a few wind power plants or solar plants, then we actually take a regional economic hit from doing so because of all of the displaced mine workers. So that's an example of a trade-off. So we have something that is moving forward in a positive direction from a climate change perspective, but from a local economic perspective, there are going to be people that are hurting because they're out of work. However, you could think about how that could be transitioned into a synergy, right? So for example, what if we had a proven way that we could sort of retrain people to work in a renewable energy economy? And I don't mean just like, send them back to school. I mean like really provide them with the necessary training so that they can easily transition from life as a coal miner, say, to life as a wind turbine operator or a technician or something like that. We have the ability to do that, but we haven't done it very well. And what that means then is that what could be a win-win is instead a win-lose.
So you think about coal, for example, in southern Illinois, the black lung, the incidence of black lung in southern Illinois is just tremendous. And my wife is a primary care, is a nurse practitioner at practices in Carbondale, and the number of people she sees with black lung is just, it boggles my mind. Being from central Illinois, I didn't think that was really something that, I don't know, you always think about like West Virginia, for example, as black lung, but southern Illinois has a lot of black lung. And that's an occupational hazard. That reduces somebody's life by a non-negligible amount of time, and it causes a lot in healthcare costs and just reduces quality of life tremendously. So, things like that need to be considered. The human toll, along with the environmental toll, need to be considered for when we think about the advantages and disadvantages of different energy systems. So solar and wind, for example, don't really have that disadvantage. Nobody's getting black lung from wind power.
And unfortunately, it feels like we haven't had that leadership from above. We need Washington, D.C. to say, this is our goal, right? So in the early 60s, when all of a sudden our goal was to get a man on the moon and like do or die, we're all working for this common goal. Why couldn't we do that now? Why couldn't we have do or die? We are going to figure out an alternative to fossil fuels in the next 5 years, right? We could do that. We could do that. But we need that momentum, that inspiration from above.
The developed countries really have to take the role here. The developed economies, so we're talking about the US, most of Europe, Australia, Russia, China, South Korea, Japan, those areas, those countries really have to take the role and say, we will reduce our emissions dramatically and shift to carbon neutral energy systems because we have the money and the ability the capacity to do that. And for the developing nations of the world that don't have that capacity, that don't have the money to do that, we need to understand that those nations will still need to rely predominantly on coal or natural gas or even maybe biofuels like wood to create energy for at least the next few decades in order for their economies to develop to the point where they can actually then shift to more carbon neutral sources. And so this tragedy of the commons that we see so often is say, well, India is still going to use biofuel or coal to create most of their energies, and Indonesia will, and Uganda will. So why should we even bother changing things in the U.S.? That kind of thinking is not going to get us to a good solution. We've had plenty of time to develop our economy on the back of fossil fuels, and we've done a very good job of that. Right, it's still the largest economy in the world, and we have some of the best quality of life here in the U.S. and most of that is built on fossil fuels. So we've taken our turn, and we've certainly used our fair share and then some of the world's non-renewable resources. Not to mention that if you think about national security, which is cited in everything anymore as a reason to do stuff. National security, the best way to increase national security is completely eliminate our dependence on foreign oil, right? You hear even people like Ted Cruz say that we need to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. Well, the best way to do that, use solar and wind, right? And we can create all that we need right there. So we don't have to worry about Iranian oil or what the Saudis are doing, because we don't need their oil. The biggest thing from this is that a change to stay under that 1.5 degrees, to meet our target goals, that change is not going to come from individuals. It could come from, it has to come, it's a systematic change. It's a change in our industries. It's a change in our society, right? Now that can come from individuals pushing politicians and businesses to change their cultures. But I want to kind of make that point that if you don't use less plastic, don't use palm oil, make sure you only eat organic produce, eat less meat, that sort of thing. That's great, and that will reduce your individual carbon footprint, but the problem is not the individual, the problem is the system.
The truth was hard to handle, and if anything, I was more scared than I was before. The transformation that we need to make seems immeasurable. All of this started with the IPCC report that said we have 12 years to transform our society. I wanted to know what the professors envisioned for our future, so I asked each of them what they saw the U.S. doing in the next 12 years, and this is what they said.
I think that we will depend on electricity for transportation more and more. You look at the electric car offerings that are on the market today, they're way more than they were 5 years ago. I think that's going to be an exponential curve. I mean, there was a Volvo, I think it was, who is going completely electric. Their entire line will be electric by 2025, I think, or something like that, and they're not the only ones. So that is something as well that we'll see in the next 12 years. I think by 2030, another thing is that the majority of us will be driving electric cars, honestly. At least the majority of us driving cars that are like 5 years or newer will be driving electric cars. So that is something that will be really interesting to see. And so I think that is something that, you know, by 2030 the U.S. can do, and I think that probably will happen.
I hope we have a U.S. government that realizes that climate change is real and happening right now, and we need to take action immediately. Unfortunately, I don't see that in Washington. I see pockets of it. People know, smart people know, but I still see a lot of head in the sand denial among our politicians. And there's a lot of motivation because of money and lobbying and, you know, political donations and re-election campaigns and all of this. That sort of money influences politicians to continue to deny the fact that humans are definitely a part of climate change. We're definitely a contributor, and we need to take action.
Honestly, from a personal perspective, I don't see us doing very much in the next 12 years. I think if anything positive comes out of the next 12 years on the climate action side, it's going to be that we take our first steps toward reducing our emissions, which is more than we've done now. So I think any movement in that direction is positive. But I personally don't see us making that move in time to avoid 1.5 degrees. I think we'll be very lucky if we make that move in time to avoid 2 degrees Celsius of warming. I know that's not very uplifting, but that is my personal view. I think that what I've seen so far gives me very little hope that we will avoid 1.5 degrees C of warming. I know. Let's jump out the window, I guess. I don't know. I know. That's the nature of it. But like I said at the end of my talk, you know, it is worth mentioning that this report provides a framework so that when we do get it together and decide that we're going to do something about this problem, that we kind of have a recipe, right? And we can solve the problem. We know what we have to do. The question is overcoming some of those sort of societal issues that we just can't get over the hump.
All right.
Yeah. Sorry to be a downer there at the end.
That's okay. Thank you so much.
All right, Kitt. Yeah, it was nice talking with you.